Welcome to episode 468. On this week's show, scientists discover a parasite that could let you live for 200 years, keep you perpetually young, and make you popular. But there's a little catch. Then we have 3 stories from the What Could Possibly Go Wrong department. A woman lets God take the wheel, literally. Ancient viruses are discovered in ice cores from 15,000 years ago. And the Creation Museum in Kentucky has announced their next project, rebuilding the Tower of Babel in order to end racial divisions. Then, Phil's a bit confused about a Norwegian Olympic team's decision to wear shorts rather than the mandated bikini bottoms. Is this a victory for conservative or progressive values? And then you don't want to miss the interview today I have with Mike Cosper. He's the guy behind the new podcast from CT that everyone's talking about, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. The story about the famed Seattle megachurch and its controversial pastor, Mark Driscoll, shines a light on many of the values that are still driving American evangelicalism. So we've got a little bit of everything on today's show, some science, some silliness, and some serious insights. So let's get started. Welcome to the Holy Post.
Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I am here with Skye Jitani.
Hi,
Skye?
Phil.
Is it Skye this week, or is
It
Psych show
it has
up?
always only been Skye, Phil.
Oh, come on. No. And Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, guys.
You've been sitting in that hotel room in Pensacola Beach for an entire week.
It's awesome.
What?
It's awesome. When I'm not here, I'm at the beach. So,
It must be
see
great.
my tan?
Your new Pensacola life.
I wish I could be here. I'm a beach
have
baby.
you ever had a Pensacola? Then there's also Diet Pensacola, which is
I've only had the diet kind.
yeah, okay. And Jason here, who has not eaten any cinnamon rolls at all. But we were discussing that he's going to do separate ratings for homemade cinnamon rolls versus store-bought or professionally made cinnamon rolls, and that the best homemade cinnamon roll he's ever had was made by
Jenna Kurtnacker. So it's a huge
The
shout out to
winner
Jenna
is-
and the Kurtnacker family. They were awesome. I got to visit them down in Orange County, and there's awesome people. And she made me a cinnamon roll, and it was maybe the best cinnamon roll I've ever had. I'm pretty sure.
Oh my gosh! Can you
And
give
for
us
those of
their
you
address?
For those of you who don't know, Jeff Kurtnacker is the composer for The Girl Who Wore Freedom. If you haven't seen that yet, go to iTunes or Apple TV
Yes.
and watch The Girl Who Wore Freedom. Listen to the music and then ask Jenna to make you a cinnamon roll.
So Jenna's cinnamon rolls are every bit as good as Jeff's scores.
It sounds like it. He's an
it's
award-winning
better, yeah.
composer.
Better.
Oh, it's better?
No offense to
All
Jeff.
right.
He does great music, but the cinnamon rolls win.
All right. All right, time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, I got a bunch of little stories. We're not going to do like one big giant topic that'll make everyone mad and, say terrible things about us. We're not going to do that this week. We're going to do a bunch of little stories that will make everyone mad and say terrible things about us.
Oh, no.
So,
Cool.
and we're not
That's my
doing
paper cut.
it's not news of the butt, but it is animal news. I've got.
I love animal news.
Yes, and this is one of the most amazing animal stories that I've ever come across, which I think has huge theological implications. It's just
I can't
life-changing.
wait.
Okay,
Are you
Chris,
going to create a theme song for animal news?
I probably should. Yeah, I probably
Yeah.
should, because I keep
so.
finding more. I always think,
Mhm.
well, no, this isn't a thing. But then, oh, look, there's another one. I better do that one too. So you know what a tapeworm is, right? Everyone knows what
I
a tapeworm
do.
is.
They
Yeah,
live
so-
in the bellies of baby puppies that are lost in the woods, and when they poop, they come out and they're little, white, and wiggly.
This is not
Right?
news of the butt, Christian.
Okay, I'm not sure that that's exactly right, but
Yes,
all
it is.
that could be a different kind of worm too. If your dog just has worms, because people get like all creatures get tapeworms. Anyway,
That's true. But isn't it
did
from
you know-
water?
from wherever, I don't know, from wherever tapeworms are. I don't know. Actually, the story isn't about tapeworms, except
Oh,
do you know there are tapeworms that live inside ants?
no.
I
How
know.
is that possible?
I know. Isn't that freaky to start out with?
How
With
big
the-
is
You
the
think
ant?
that would be like a neutron? It would have to be so little, like a little, I don't know, little
Yes.
tiny.
They're
Particle.
neutronic tapeworms that were engineered by Bruce Baxter. in his laboratory. No, there are tapeworms that are so small that in one ant they found 70 of them.
Stop
70.
it.
You know,
This is not true, Phil. You're making this up.
okay, I have to tell you. So think about an ant with 70 tapeworms living in it. Okay, that's amazing. That is the least amazing part of this story. Okay, can I take it from here?
I just want to ask you one question.
They've
Is this from
discovered
the
a
Onion?
species. No, they've discovered a species of tapeworm that live inside ants. It is a parasite. It has a parasitic relationship with the ant. It changes the ant. And here's how it changes the ant, because this is extraordinary. Ants that have these parasites in them, these little tiny mini neutronic tapeworms in them, don't appear to age. They stay young looking. And it's not just young ants. I didn't know this. Young ants tend to be lighter in color and shinier than older ants. And then they get older and they get darker and more dull. So these ants that have these tapeworms in their tummies stay young, light, and shiny.
Give me those tapeworms.
Do these tapeworms resemble Paul Rudd?
No, the ants do, though.
They don't. Maybe that's a secret.
If I eat the ants with the tapeworms, will I then be young, bright, and glowy?
Only after you poop like a puppy in the woods. Okay, so
it's like a fountain of youth, but it's tapeworms. You have to ingest the tapeworms.
I'm not done yet, though. There's more.
Oh, goodness.
The ants with the tapeworms will live up to 3 times as long as a normal ant would live.
I'm going to go find those tapeworms.
They extend their lives.
Okay.
So give me the tapeworms.
There's got to be a downside here.
So picture this. Wait, there's actually more upside. I'm not done with all the upside yet. So the ants that are infected by these tapeworms is the equivalent of you, like I'm just going to look like I'm 25 for 280 years or 240 years of my life. I'm going to look like I'm 25 and I'm going to live for 240 years. Okay. That's what a parasite is doing to ants. And there's
the ants.
There's one last thing they do to the ants. Is this the bad thing? No, it's not. They make the ants popular.
What do you mean by that?
The ants become favored in their colonies.
I know why, because everybody wants to mate with them, so they will pass the tapeworms on.
You know what, Christian? I have news for you. Ants don't mate. They have a queen that lays eggs. There's not a whole.
There has to be a boy.
Well, everyone is a boy except the queen, I think. Yeah. But
so I guess I better study ant biology because I'm a little behind.
Ants that are infected by these tapeworms stay young looking, live 3 times as long, and for some reason, the rest of the colony feeds them and takes care of them and does their work for them so they don't have to work at all. So they stop working.
So these ants are living the life that every prosperity preacher promises us, basically. Popularity, success, health, longevity, it's all there. We just need to put it in a bottle and sell it on late night television.
Yes, you'll be young and beautiful forever, and you'll never have to lift a finger again. All you have to do is swallow these tapeworms.
Okay, stand by. Now, there's something that's missing from this whole cockamamie story.
Yes.
How the heck does any ant know whether or not there is a tapeworm inside another ant unless they have some sort of MRI down there in that anthill that I don't know about?
I don't think they know that. I don't think they figured that out yet. Except that these ants keep looking young, so that could be something. It's like, whoa, what's with this ant? It's still young after all these hours. It's still young. I don't know.
Don't ants communicate with one another through like scent?
Yeah,
so maybe the ant with the tapeworms gives off a slightly different scent, but it's really appealing, right?
Yeah. So
that I'll buy.
So it sounds like it's all good, and this is where it gets interesting. This is a case of a parasitic relationship that is beneficial to the individual but harmful to the community.
Ooh,
kind of like Donald Trump. Like,
okay,
hang on.
No, wait, no, seriously. His relationship with the Republican Party is very beneficial to Donald Trump, even though it's harmful to the whole community.
Okay.
There you
All
go.
right.
There's
Okay,
my
but
political
still,
application
we're
for the
not
night.
going
Wow,
to
that was
disparage people on our
fast.
podcast.
Yeah.
We're
I'm
going
not
to make sure we
disparaging
respect
anybody.
people.
I'm
not disparaging
You
anybody.
just
Okay.
called Donald Trump a parasite.
You
You
did.
called him a
But,
tapeworm.
well,
You
if the
called him a
shoe fits,
tapeworm.
wear it.
Okay, so here's what it does. Because if you have a lot of infection in your colony, all of the unaffected ants have to work harder to care for and feed the infected ants. So the whole colony starts to show signs of stress and fatigue. So they said it's one of the few examples in nature where a parasite benefits an individual to the detriment of the individual's community. Interesting,
Wow,
huh?
What
it's
I
actually a remarkable parable of social inequality and unequal distribution of wealth. Because if you have
absolutely.
a growing upper class and fewer people to serve them, it creates social tension, which leads to revolution. This is the dialectic. This is Marxism.
Oh, great. Now we're promoting Marxism through
No,
tapeworms.
but that's
That's just what
exactly
we
what I
needed.
thought. Nature mimics culture, and we can learn.
I think it's the other way,
Or I guess
Christian.
I think it's the other
I
way
think
around.
it's the
Culture
other way.
mimics nature. Yep. And God reveals himself in nature. So we could see this as God's way of giving us some sort of instructive lesson for our human constructs. Good job, Phil.
Thank you. We were at the part now where I was going to say, okay, Skye, sermon illustration, go.
Sermon illustration. It's 1 Corinthians 12. It's the body of Christ, where every part has its gifts and needs to contribute to the edification of the whole. And one part can't say to the other, "I don't need you." And so, if you have people with a parasitic infection that makes them really smart, beautiful, and healthy, and they think they don't have to pull their weight and everyone else is just supposed to serve them, that's a broken body of Christ. And actually it illustrates what we've talked about at length in the show, sort of the celebrity culture within the church, where some people think that everyone exists to serve me and further my agenda.
Kardashians.
Right. Well, but even with church leaders, it's like all these people come and they're here to help me advance my agenda. And it's all about serving the pastor or the leadership rather than a healthy, functional body.
Narcissistic pastors probably have a tapeworm infestation that makes
Good
them
corollary.
look young, hang around far too long, and get more popular than they really should be.
There you go.
There
That's
you
it.
go. Because I was going to work on something like the kingdom of God is like a tapeworm that, comes into your life and then makes you, gives you eternal life and makes you popular with God. But yours was way better.
Yeah, his is way better.
Yours
Sorry.
was way better.
That's
All
why
right.
he's the pastor and you're the comedian.
I'm moving on. That's really not in my bio,
No, well, it should be.
It does say humorist. My bio does say humorist. So
and
I
you
guess.
did want to be Stephen Colbert. That's how this whole podcast started, if you recall.
Dang it, you're right. Okay, this is. I have three very short stories from our new department of what could possibly go wrong.
We need a theme song for that.
What could possibly go wrong? Okay. Story number one. Woman crashes into multiple cars and a house at 120 miles per hour after, quote, letting God take the wheel. An Ohio woman caused an impressive amount of carnage after running a red light at over 100 miles an hour and crashing through multiple cars, a utility pole, and a house.
I bet atheists love this story.
The reason for the crash is perhaps even wilder, as the driver admits to running the light with her kid in the car on purpose to, quote, test her faith with God.
Wow.
The driver had her 11-year-old kid in the car, and thankfully, there were no major injuries to her, the kid, the driver of the other cars she hit, or the occupants of the house. So one question is, did her test work?
Did God take the wheel?
Okay, wait, I have a question.
Yes.
If God took the wheel, who had the pedals? Because to go 120 miles an hour, she had to have her foot.
Does Jesus have the
accelerator?
Pedals? That's true. So she was in control of her velocity, just not her direction. Is that biblical?
Did she think that Jesus take the wheel is in the Bible and not in a Twyla, whatever her name is.
It's
Faith
not
Hill.
Twyla.
Is it Faith?
No,
who is
it's
it?
not Faith Hill. It's one of the
Carrie Underwood?
Underwood?
Carrie
Underwood.
Underwood.
Yeah.
Yes, Carrie Underwood. Maybe she forgot it was not a popular song and she thought it was in the Bible.
See, this is the problem with taking everything literally rather than contextualizing it and understanding this is a metaphor.
Yeah. She told police she'd been going through some, quote, trials and tribulations and was recently fired from her job. So she intentionally drove at the high speed and through the red light to, quote, test her faith with God. The woman said she, quote, let go and let God take the wheel, the police report said, adding that she believed she did the right thing.
So do the
Even
Nazis.
after the accident and all of that?
I think so, because no one was seriously hurt. So now she knows
Can I
that
play
she
devil's
can
advocate?
trust
This woman
God.
needs a psych evaluation.
Yeah.
Wait, can I play devil's advocate here?
Sure, Christian.
Just for a second.
Sure, go for it, Christian.
In my life, what I have noticed is that God will allow me to experience the consequences of my choices. Sometimes those are very negative. And in the end, for me personally, I have learned from him through the negative. And so, in a sense, you could say that he was present during that time and the guardrails were there, and maybe she will have learned a lesson and learned that God loved her and protected her.
Well, she faces charges of felony assault, endangering a child, and driving under a suspended license.
Like I said, consequences suck.
Yeah,
Maybe she'll learn something in prison.
Didn't you say she still thinks she did the right thing?
Yeah, it appears that she says she still thinks she did the right
when she's
thing.
in that jail cell, she's going to be sitting there puzzling all of this out. And God was probably going to say to her, I took the wheel and you needed to be off the streets. So now you're in this cell to think about your actions.
Yeah,
we have
weirdly, crashes where people just let go of the wheel happen more often than you'd probably expect. In 2020, a Pennsylvania woman rammed a Kia Optima into another car as a, quote, test of faith. In 2018, a Tennessee man rolled his truck 5 times after letting go of the wheel. And
my word.
Letting
Carrie
God.
Underwood,
let go,
what have
let
you
God.
done?
Yes, what have you wrought? Which led one commenter to say at the bottom of the story, religion is seriously a poison on humanity. So what do you say with that, Skye? What do you say with that impulse to let go and let God in very literal and highly public, dangerous ways?
It's a metaphor. These people are. It's insane. But to that comment about religion is a dangerous force or whatever the guy said, yes, for certain people it is, but I suspect that there are other people who probably ran to the scene of those accidents, who gave blood to people who are injured, who put themselves in harm's way to help others, who may well have also been motivated by religious impulses. So it's not that religion is universally just a force for damage and evil. It can also be a great force for beauty and goodness and healing and care. So
we do need to bring some level of logic and discernment along with our religious fervor, right?
yes, absolutely.
Okay.
But
Next,
for people who are mentally unstable, though, the religion becomes a great vehicle for them to express it. There's no doubt about that. Second
story. What could possibly go wrong? We're turning now to science. 15,000-year-old viruses were pulled from a Tibetan glacier. 2 ice core samples drilled from the Tibetan plateau yielded over 30 different viruses from the last ice age. A team of microbiologists studying glacier ice in Tibet found 33 different viruses dating back to the Pleistocene in the core samples they pulled up. At least 28 of these viruses are novel, meaning we've never seen them before. We just found them buried deep in the ice, and now we've pulled them out to see what they do.
This is a start of a very bad movie.
Was that?
It's like if you were digging in the ice and you found like, oh, look, this guy's kind of with frozen guys kind of dressed like a supervillain. Let's thaw him out and see what he does. You wouldn't do that.
This looks like a giant Tyrannosaurus Rex that could eat people alive. Let's
not.
warm him up and see what happens.
The team's cores, the ice cores, this is fun, were wrapped in plastic and put into cardboard sheaths encased in aluminum. This already sounds like something a supervillain would do. Then they were shipped out of the ice cap in freezers on a truck, then a plane, then another plane, and then a truck again, and are now stored at the Bird, Polar, and Climate Research Center at The Ohio State University.
Get
So
off
they're
of
in
that
Ohio.
campus.
They're
Get
in
off of that campus, people.
Okay.
I thought
Go
they
to
were going to
another
say.
college.
I thought they were saying they're going to take him to the novel coronavirus lab in Wuhan, China.
Oh, that would be. That's too obvious, Skye.
Yeah.
That's too obvious. They did. The scientists did say they're most likely of no danger to humans.
That's
Yeah.
reassuring.
Right.
Most likely.
Okay, last story. Third story in our exciting new series. What could possibly go wrong? Ken Ham and the Creation Museum Ark Encounter have new plans to build a Tower of Babel attraction. Yes, they're building a new Tower of Babel. And it gets even better. So they're building. Why are they building a Tower of Babel, you ask? The first one didn't work out so well. They plan to build the tower to tackle the racism issue.
What? What in the world does that mean?
What?
Wait a second. I'm sorry, people that like Ken Ham and the Bible Museum, for being dismissive of this idea or speaking of it in disparaging terms. However, what the heck?
This is right up there with Dennis Rodman going to North Korea to broker peace between our countries with Kim Jong-il. Like, that's how utterly ridiculous this is.
All right. Well, maybe we don't understand the whole context. Phil, keep reading.
Here's the context. The Ark Encounter, located in northern Kentucky, plans to build the tower to tackle the racism issue, quote unquote, by helping visitors understand and learn, quote, how genetics research and the Bible confirm the origin of all people groups around the world. So they're looking at, which is kind of odd because that's really not what the Tower of Babel is about. The Tower of Babel as the source of all ethnic diversity. And so if you can show that that we're really all part of one human race, then finally the racism issue will be solved at the Tower of Babel, which launched Babylon as the symbol of evil in the world.
Wait, that confused me. So I'm sorry. I'm a little slow to the party. Unwrap that for me.
I'm not sure entirely it's a rational party that you're slow or fast.
Okay, I'm not a great student of white supremacist theology.
Uh-oh.
But
any statement you're going to make that starts that way, Skye.
But the last time I checked, like, Christian white supremacists don't deny a common human origin of all the races.
Now they don't. They used to. Long ago.
What?
Wait, I didn't even know that.
Like, what do they say? Like the African races come from Ham and the other races. Yeah, but that's still a shared origin. They're all descendants of Noah, right?
Right. So, you are correct.
So no white supremacist, or let's just say flat out racist, denies the shared human origin of all people.
Okay.
What they argue is that as humans developed and spread throughout the world and created different cultures and languages and everything, that certain cultures are superior to others. So simply creating a Tower of Babel story that says, yeah, we actually all come from the same genetic, pool of people from the Tower of Babel or from Noah's family or even Adam and Eve, that doesn't solve anything. No one's denying that. That's not why people are hating each other.
Oh, you are really raining on Ken Ham's parade. He was this close to solving the racism issue. Skye.
Well, there's got to be more to it.
What's the solution? How is he saying? This is the part I don't understand. How is he saying?
By showing that we're all linked to a common ancestry.
How does building a physical tower demonstrate that?
It's what you teach inside. It's what you teach inside the building. You go
have
inside.
Something to sell admission to.
How does speaking a different language determine your skin color?
I'm not even going to try to make that connection because I don't think it's there. So, okay, what could possibly go wrong? Well, the first time we built the Tower of Babel, God scattered us across the earth. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, we're pulling up 15,000-year-old new viruses, completely new viruses that no one has ever seen before. Huh, okay, what could possibly go? Oh, what could possibly go wrong? I'm not sure if God is really there for me. I'm going to put my kids in the car and drive 120 miles an hour and then just take my hand off the wheel and see what happens. Oh, great. People, let's talk about Norway's handball team, shall we?
Please, that sounds exciting.
Norway's women's handball team has been
What is
fined.
handball? What is handball?
Okay, instead of racquetball, so in racquetball you have these like you're in a cube, all are walls except one thing of glass, and you have little rackets. Handball is no rackets, and you're playing just with just your hands,
Right,
and the
but this
ball's a
is-
little softer.
This is apparently something
Harder.
outdoor, and it looks like it's in sand. So this may be something different. I'm actually not sure what sport this is because there's a picture of the team, and they're all dressed for the beach, and they're outside in sand. So
Are they
I'm
calling it volleyball, but they're saying it's handball?
No, it's not. I don't know. It's not because they have a big net behind them. So
I'm
Olympic
looking it up.
handball is a different thing. It's kind of like soccer, I think.
okay.
It's more like they have nets,
Okay.
they have goals. That's my vague recollection of it.
Here's the Wikipedia entry. It's also known as European handball or Olympic handball is a team sport in which two teams of 7 players each, 6 outcourt players and a goalkeeper, pass a ball using their hands with the aim of throwing it into the goal of the other team. A standard match consists of 2 periods of 30 minutes, and the team that scores more goals wins. So basically, it's the inverse of soccer.
Yeah,
Where
it's
soccer, you can only use your feet and not your hands. This is you use your hands, and I suppose not your feet.
It's
I don't
soccer
know.
So
for
it's
the
kind of like soccer and rugby combined.
It's soccer for the clumsy. Norway's handball team, women's handball team, has been fined. Why were they fined? The European Handball Federation has thrown the book at the Norway women's team because of improper clothing. What was their impropriety? Are you wondering?
Were they
Kristen?
wearing thongs? Because since I've been in Florida and I was
You've
on the
s-
beach for 2 days, I've seen lots of women wearing thongs, and I do not get it. Can I just say women? What is up with that? I do not want to see your butt cheeks. I don't understand that.
Jason, would you like to say anything?
No, I think they just should stay out of it. They should stay. Nobody say a word.
Sorry,
do not respond to me.
My connection. I'm going through a tunnel.
The impropriety. What did they do wrong? They wore shorts instead of the regulation bikini bottoms. It is regulation.
Good for them. I'm
that you wear-
all approving.
In the team's bronze medal match against Spain, the Norway team opted to wear longer shorts that provided more coverage. For this, each player was fined 150 euros by the European Handball Federation. And this is where it gets interesting. It may not surprise you to learn that the men's handball teams have no such rules and are allowed to compete in shorts as long as 4 inches above the knee. Women, however, are not allowed to wear bottoms that cover more than 10 centimeters of their butts.
Are men in charge of these rules?
Okay, I'm looking at the picture right now. And like, I don't know if people have an image in their mind of like women wearing very loose, baggy, say soccer type shorts. That's
No.
not the shorts
No,
they're
it's-
wearing.
Bike shorts.
They're bike shorts. They're skin tight bike shorts.
Yeah, they're spandex,
Yeah,
the
but
same
that's-
ones that they wear in
That's
volleyball,
so
actually.
that is so more appropriate, in my opinion.
Than a bikini bottom.
than
I
a
agree.
bikini, especially when you're running around and you're diving in sand and blah blah blah. I mean, what I don't understand, seriously, and this is not a joke, are men writing these rules?
This is what I want to get at, because the other news that people may have followed is the German women's gymnastics team that's refusing to wear leotards and are instead wearing unitards that cover your legs all the way down to your ankles. And their belief is that the leotards, those little things where your legs are completely bare, and they actually have to use glue in some cases to keep them stuck to your butt cheeks.
Yeah.
There's butt glue for Olympic women's gymnastics leotards, so that you're not always having to, make sure you didn't uncover a cheek while you were doing that move. So the German women's team just said, we don't want to do that anymore. We feel like we're being sexualized in this sport, so we are going to cover ourselves up. So, which is something, this is so interesting because it's something you would expect to see, from a Muslim country who are saying, okay, we can't be in this if we're not modest. But it's coming from Germany. In this case, it's coming from Norway. So some of the most progressive countries on earth we have women that are now, and this is why I'm trying to figure out, is this conservative or is this progressive? Is a new progressivism becoming conservatism in saying, wait a minute, so in the 60s, we wanted to wear bikinis, we wanted to wear shorts, and we didn't want you to tell us we couldn't. Now we've become so kind of enculturated to women being exposed that it's become radical to say, no, I don't want to wear that. I don't want to expose myself that way. I want to choose to be more covered up and to not be sexualized. And so is this a return of conservatism, or is this progressivism finding a new way to express itself? Skye?
How about this? What if it's neither? And what if it's just dignifying women by giving them the choice to wear what they want when they are engaging in professional sports or international sports? I is the German team in trouble for having the unitard in the gymnastics?
No,
Is that a violation of some kind?
no. They're
Good.
just going against the flow of, this is how we've always done it. We always wear these little short things, and they're saying we feel like it may be part of the Me Too movement, especially some of the abuse cases that were happening in women's gymnastics. With NASA and the U.S. gymnastics team, just saying, why do we have to prance around for the gaze of men? That's what we feel like we're doing. We want to cover ourselves up and not have to worry whether we need to put glue on our butts to keep our shorts on, just so we look the way you say we're supposed to look. So I think that is awesome. I think there's just a really interesting story where our culture has become so used to the okay, if you're a male athlete, we praise you because you're strong. If you're a female athlete, we don't quite praise you because you're strong, because we also want you to be sexy. No one asks Shaq to be sexy. But if you're going to
The
get
Love Shack. Remember that song? Wasn't that all about him?
Yes.
I love that song. Thank you.
From the
you're a-
B-52s? Yeah.
If you're a female athlete and you're going to get endorsement deals, we want you to be able to be in the swimsuit issue in Sports Illustrated. We want you to be in the body issue in ESPN where you appear nude.
This is kind of like the worker ants fighting back from and rebelling against those tapeworm-ridden beauty ants.
It's exactly that.
I mean, okay,
I think it's revival. I think it's a breakout of revival, and we're all going to return to church.
I hope you're right, Phil.
Bike shorts.
I think it's great that some of these teams are choosing to wear shorts or unitards or whatever. What I don't understand is why certain sports regulate that you have to wear a bikini bottom. Like we were watching the sand volleyball Olympic event the other night,
right?
And like that same thing, they're wearing very small.
The guys wear baggy shorts and t-shirts,
right?
And the girls wear the tiniest bikinis you can imagine, and then you wonder how they stay on.
So why don't these different sports organizers just say, hey, you can wear whatever is advantageous or comfortable or whatever you want? Why does it have to? I don't get it. I don't get the regulation.
That's happened. That's happened in beach volleyball before, and viewership drastically dropped. So
of course, and
for
we all know
viewership
why.
reasons, they don't want to.
It's like, you remember they wanted to do a women's football league, and so it was the lingerie football league. They had women play football in lingerie, and then it got ratings.
What are you talking about?
It was a thing. That was a thing. They did a lingerie football league.
Let me ask you something. Professionally now, because I haven't been watching women's volleyball, there was a switch not long ago with women's volleyball, like, in high school. And Phil, your girls played volleyball, where they went to these really tight, really short, basically underwear-looking shorts.
Spandex.
Yeah, spandex. What were the boys wearing at that time? Or what did they wear?
Big, baggy basketball shorts.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it was a completely gendered thing where this was a more attractive look for a woman, and men look like this.
That makes me mad.
Yeah, I know.
Can we change this, because I'm getting hot under the collar?
Yeah, that was the last thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it's interesting that female athletes are saying, I feel like the standards that have developed for female athletes are sexualizing us.
Go girls. Me too.
And we do that on purpose. Why do we do that on purpose? Because it gets better TV ratings. We can get more men to watch if the women playing football are in their underwear.
Okay. Ugh. Yuck.
How come that hasn't happened to certain sports? So like soccer. My daughter's a big soccer player. Amanda loves
Yeah.
watching soccer. She plays, but like women's soccer, they don't dress that way.
They wear the same thing men wear. I don't know.
Pretty
And
much,
women's
yeah.
Unless
women's
you're
basketball
Brandy
is the same thing.
Chastain when
Right.
you rip off your shirt and you have your
Yeah,
jock
that's
bra
a whole
on.
different thing. That's
But
that-
is it? I don't know. I mean,
I
there's
would
always
love
been
to
the
say I would love to say it's a move to desexualize women. I think it's probably more of a move just for agency. That everyone should decide whether they want to be sexualized or not. And that's a good thing. It would be nice if we, I'm sick of all of the clickbait, that I see on social media and elsewhere of look at this supermodel who's now 50 and she still looks hot. And so she's in a bikini to show that she's still hot at 50. Well, couldn't you just be pretty at 50? Do you have to be hot at 50? Why do we have to be hot? Can we be pretty? Is that okay?
You're pretty, Phil.
Thank you.
You're not hot.
Pretty at 55. Actually, my air conditioning's been on for this entire podcast, and I am hot at the moment. So anyway, do we have a guest today, Skye?
Of course we do.
That's fantastic. And the world is changing in many crazy and wonderful ways with what we can wear while we're playing handball in the sand and what tapeworms can do to ants. And that Jesus Take the Wheel is no longer just a song.
And we have no bikini requirement for guests on the Holy Post.
That's fantastic.
And can I just say one thing before we go?
Except
Phil,
that
would you
one time where
please-
Jason volunteered to wear a bikini.
Yeah, but it was just
It
cinnamon
was one
rolls.
time.
Yes, sorry, Christian.
No, that's okay. I just really would love to see Jason in a cinnamon roll bikini. That's all. And anyway. Forget it. Forget I said that. That image now just popped into my head and I'm not happy about it. I'm sorry for you listeners. Please, I'm so sorry. But anyway, my question is, Phil, would you please find those ants with the tapeworms? I
Yes.
want them for Christmas, if not before.
Yes. We'll put them inside lollipops. So you get a lollipop and
I love it.
eternal life. A lollipop and
idea.
eternal life at the same time. All right.
Let's
Thanks
do
for
it.
listening in, guys. Thanks for your support. And we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
If you're newer to the Holy Post, you may not know that we're able to produce this show because of people like you. Folks who believe it's important to create really thoughtful Christian content from people who don't take themselves too seriously, even though they take faith in Christ very seriously. If you want to support our show, you can go to holypost.com and click on the Support Us button, which will take you to our Patreon page. There you can learn about the different bonus material you can get at different levels of support, including bonus interviews, access to a monthly live stream where you can interact with me, Phil, and Christian directly, as well as special merchandise and art that's signed by me, Phil, and Christian. So by going to Patreon and supporting us, you'll not only get more of the content and material that you love already, but you'll be guaranteeing that more people can encounter the Holy Post as we grow the podcast in the months ahead. Thank you to everyone who's supported us so far, and if you're not yet a Patreon supporter, go learn more by going to holypost.com and clicking Support Us. So a few months ago, I got to listen to a preview episode of a new podcast that was being produced by Christianity Today. It was about Mars Hill, the famed Seattle megachurch that was started by Mark Driscoll back in the 1990s and grew to become one of the most influential churches in the country. Driscoll had a massive impact on a whole generation of young church leaders, especially those who were drawn to the Reformed tradition of theology, but then it all came crashing down in 2014. Mark Driscoll was essentially driven out of ministry, and shortly after he left, Mars Hill collapsed. The story of Mars Hill that's told in the new CT podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, is just brilliantly produced, and it gives a remarkable insight not only into what abusive Christian leadership can look like and why megachurches are inherently fragile, but it also gives deep insight into the pathologies and values that drive so much of American evangelicalism, even outside the megachurch world. For all those reasons, I'm really happy to have Mike Cosper on the show today. He is the writer and podcaster behind The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. He talks about the production of the show, what he learned by interviewing so many people connected to Mars Hill, and he gives us some insight into how no ministry or even ministry leader is entirely good or entirely bad. Like families, we're all a mess and we are all complicated. And while there is damage and wounds that often happens God still miraculously does good things in the midst of it, and that's certainly true of the Mars Hill story. So I hope you'll listen to our conversation and take away some deep insights about what might be wrong in the American church, but also walk away with some deep hope that God is still at work even in broken and fragile systems. For those of you who are Patreon supporters, you're going to get access to a bonus interview I recorded with Mike Cosper about the role that sexuality played in the rise and fall of Mars Hill. I know that sounds a little bit strange, but it actually played a critical part of the story, and you're not going to want to miss that interview. It's incredibly interesting. So if you're not a Patreon supporter, this is a great day to jump on and become one so you get access to that material as well as a bunch of other stuff. Okay, here is my conversation with Mike Cosper. Mike Cosper, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, first, just congratulations on the success of your podcast. As I mentioned before we started recording, I'm bumping into people constantly who are talking about this. This is I assume it's the first podcast you've executed of this style, sort of this storytelling, investigative style, or am I wrong? Did you do something before you were at CT?
We did I did a pilot back in 2016 for a show I wanted to produce called The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. And the premise was kind of like, sort of the perils of Christian faithful presence. And so we did it as kind of an origin story for a nonprofit I was trying to launch. And the hope had been that we would raise funds and do a bunch more, but that didn't work out. So that's about it. There'll be some people who are familiar with that episode because it did really well. It found an audience, but it's sort of the joy of being at CT is they were willing to take a risk and give me the opportunity and the time to make this one.
Well, I'm super glad they did. So before we jump into some of the content, because you're only 4 episodes in to what I think is a 12 episode series. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. 12 episodes and a few bonus episodes will be coming as well.
Okay. So for those who haven't listened, or for people who just are unaware of anything that happened between, 1995 and 2015, briefly describe what is Mars Hill, or what was Mars Hill, and bring people up to speed just on the basic parameters of the story you're telling.
Yeah, so Mars Hill was planted by actually planted by 3 guys: Mark Driscoll, Leif Moy, Mike Gunn. Driscoll really quickly kind of became the lead guy, the figurehead for the organization as well. And for its first 5-6 years, it was a Seattle church. It was very much defined by kind of a young subculture. And then as it grew and took hold, Mark became more and more of kind of a national name and associated with like the Young Restless Reformed movement. And then every 4 or 5 years they grew a ton. They started a multi-site kind of effort. Multi-site expanded into multi-state, and just this massive sort of empire and influence, up to 15 locations, 15,000 people, and then they had churches. They had hundreds of churches beyond that who would stream Mark's content. They weren't officially connected, but every Sunday they were watching Mark's sermons on screens, and so it just had this an incredible footprint. But there were, Mark was a controversial figure, and there were early scandals and concerns, and starting in 2007 was the first time some of that became public, and it just ratcheted up to the point where in 2014 he was asked to go on a leave of absence. He was investigated, and before that process was finished, he resigned and stepped down. And then I think the most remarkable part of it is that he stepped down, and 3 months later, the church closed its doors. So yeah, I mean, and the podcast is, as we've tried to sort of frame for people, the podcast is the story of this church. It's how did this church come to be, and how did this church end up structured in such a way that when he resigned, the right decision for them was to close their doors.
Okay, so in recent years, many of us have become all too familiar with church scandals, megachurch scandals in particular, celebrity pastor scandals, and your show has all of those elements. But what I really appreciate about what you've done is this isn't just an investigative report about Mark Driscoll and his shortcomings, nor is it just a report about the rise and fall of Mars Hill, despite the title. You're really using Mars Hill as a lens through which to look at a lot of American evangelicalism. And I want to begin by talking about the rise of Mars Hill, because those episodes so far, you've done a great job of showing how Mars Hill fits into this larger stream of American megachurch evangelicalism. Talk a little bit about that. How does Mars Hill fit into what came before it? How is it kind of just a new iteration of something that predates Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill?
You look at the phenomenon of like the celebrity pastor. There've always been kind of movement leaders, like generational, once in a generation kind of leaders throughout church history. But the phenomenon of the celebrity pastor is very much a 20th century thing, kind of the made for TV guy. And, Billy Graham is probably the most important in that sense, in sort of setting the template. But the first guy who did it, who was truly a pastor and pastored a local church, was Robert Schuller. Um, and and so what you see in Schuller is the thing that gets replicated, right? Schuller has this ability, he has this charisma, he gets on TV, and he builds this, presence, the global presence, unbelievable global reach, through his television ministry. And you see that replicated in often smaller scale kind of presences and up and down the culture in evangelicalism. Um, what I think is significant about Mars Hill is, along with that phenomenon coming to the rise, comes the phenomenon of like sort of radically recontextualizing the church for the culture. And we talk about this in the podcast: the rise of the Jesus movement, the rise of the seeker movement. When Mars Hill emerges, it's along with a massive boom in church planting that took place in the late 90s and early 2000s. And the messaging of that boom was often like, we want to reform what's come before us. But the reality of it is it was just the evolution. It was a recontextualization again, much like what had come before.
Yeah, I was a seminary student in that era from 98 to 2001, right when all this is happening. And everyone was talking about church planting. It's like that was the only really significant way to be a pastor, was to go start your own church. And at the same time, the so-called emergent church movement was going on, which was this young Gen X kind of thing that argued the way our parents' generation had configured the church was lame, it was out of touch, it wasn't relevant, and we're going to do it differently. And Mark Driscoll and some of his contemporaries just sort of fit that to a T. But looking back on it now, it feels like most of those folks, including those who led Mars Hill, they really didn't monkey that much with the fundamental structuring of the church that they had inherited from their parents' generation. It was sort of a veneer with oriental rugs and candles and some iron crosses hanging here and there, and maybe a little bit more bass and guitar in the music, but that was about it, and some torn jeans. It was style over real structural changes. Is that fair, or would you think they actually innovated something that we should respect as different?
Yeah, I think when I talked to Tony Jones about this, I thought his take on this was actually really helpful, because he basically said, look, there were two streams. One stream was guys who kind of came out of the sort of institutional church from the generation before and said, something is wrong here and we want to do it differently. And what they ended up doing was kind of what Mars Hill did, or like what the Village Church did. It was sort of a generational evolution, right? But then there were the guys who then really became Emergent Village and pushed in different directions. And you look at the origins. There's all this conversation going on about postmodernism and spiritual formation and kind of broad rethinking of church structures and all of that. And I think the divide that emerged is that when guys like Tony Jones and Doug Padgett and Brad Cecil and some of those guys, Brian McLaren, when they talked about postmodernism and rethinking, like, how do we know what we know and all of that kind of stuff, they meant it, right? Like, they really believed that we needed like hardcore deconstruction. Mark was a participant in those conversations, and there were quite a few others at the time. I mean, you can go back and see Al Mohler talking about some of this kind of stuff and trying to figure out how does the church adapt to all of this. Where the difference was is that ultimately, I think this other stream that became these big sort of next generation churches, you know, didn't embrace the philosophical underpinnings that were part of those conversations early on. And so then the emergent church happens, and it becomes, it becomes its own kind of thing. And for the most part, that seems to have sort of folded into the main line at this point.
Yeah, it definitely feels like looking back on it 20 years now that the Pagets, the McLarens, the Jones, those voices have definitely, or even Rob Bell. I always thought a fascinating book or podcast would be comparing the two Mars Hills, right? The Driscoll's Mars Hill in Seattle and Rob Bell's in Michigan, because one sort of drifts in the direction of the main line and the other drifts in the direction of a neo-fundamentalism almost. Talk about what Driscoll did in the building of Mars Hill that was so appealing to so many people. What did he intuitively understand about the religious marketplace that so many other leaders didn't get?
Yeah, I think for one thing, for starters, he really embodied kind of the ethic of Generation X. Nobody talks about Gen X anymore. Like, we just talk about boomers and millennials and how they all hate each other and all that kind of stuff. But, Gen X really was its own phenomenon. I mean, you can go back and read all the articles in the sort of the mid 90s going, what are we going to do with these people? They're disaffected and they're slackers and they're all of this. And, what I think some of the movies and the music and the art that came out at the time really reveals is these were disenchanted people, and they were there was a reaction against a lot of the sort of veneer and positivity of the 80s, that was part of the zeitgeist. I think Mark intuited that, or Mark comprehended that, and that was a lot of what drove the culture. And then you can't get away from looking at the way he deliberately and consistently and constantly talked about the need to focus ministry on men. Really believing that if you reached young men and mobilized them for the church and mobilized them to sort of reach and transform the city, that you could sort of bring women and children with them, which for a long time I think he effectively did. And that, I don't say that as an endorsement of everything he had to say about manhood, woman, at all, but simply to say that there was something about his message that definitely resonated with young men and worked for his strategy.
Yeah, in talking to some friends about your show and just the whole Mars Hill story and Mark Driscoll, I've heard a number of people try to make comparisons to Mark's appeal to that of Donald Trump. And I just recently did a series with Kristen Dumais about her book Jesus and John Wayne, and she definitely talks about Driscoll. And I think there's some fair comparisons to make, but there's also, I think some people take it too far. So Mark, I think, he's very belligerent. He's very angry in his rhetoric, authoritarian in his leadership style, which we'll get into in a little while. But the difference is, I think he sincerely believed what he said. Whereas with someone like a Trump, who's also belligerent and angry, I think it's far more cynical, because I think he's simply saying what he has figured out the crowd wants to hear. And I'm not sure he actually genuinely believes any of the crap that comes out of his mouth. But Driscoll, I think it really was sincere. And that sincerity, as off-putting as it may have been to some, was really appealing to a lot of people. And he was saying things that other people just wouldn't say, and do it in a way that was kind of shocking. And especially at the emergence of like the internet and blogs, where there's so many voices, he had the ability to rise above the noise because what he was saying was so much more outrageous than everyone else. And I think that's part of what also got him so much attention from publishers, from publicists, from the larger kind of evangelical celebrity framework, the industrial complex, as I call it. His voice was just so different and unique, and people are like, who is this guy? But it certainly wasn't cynical. I think he genuinely believed what he was saying.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that. I would say there were some performative aspects to it as well,
Yeah.
where he knew how to kind of play for the crowd. Um, I think a really significant part of Mark's success, as I've sort of investigated this over the last few years, is just he had an extraordinary team around him, just an incredibly gifted,
Hmm.
creative, talented team who knew how to take what he was doing and edit it and package it and get it out there in a way that felt natural. It didn't feel like you were being fed a package of stuff,
Yeah.
because these guys are just so good. And and it wasn't like they came into it with, we have a whole episode about this that's coming up. It wasn't like they had this sort of master plan to go like, well, here's how we're going to take over the world. It's just like you had young creative guys who were like, oh, this guy's hilarious, like let's see what we can do. And they're throwing stuff out there and going, oh wow, look at the numbers when we do this, like the numbers shoot through the roof. That was funny, Mark, say it again. Can you say it? Can you be darker? Can you be whatever?
Hmm.
And so I think that played into the success. It played in a little bit to kind of the degree to which some of it was performative. But I would say too, like, part of the appeal as well, the common thread between him and Trump is just the entertainment factor. You
Right.
know, people forget this about Trump, but he was incredibly famous before he ran for anything. He's in all these movies, all these cameos. Everybody knows who he is. He's in The Simpsons all the way back in the '90s and on, and all this kind of stuff. Um, and I think it's like the fame itself is a source of authority. Um, and that's what worked for Driscoll was, they were the first to, Mars Hill was the first to the podcasting platform. They were one of the first to the video, YouTube platform. They were ahead of all this stuff. And so once those platforms opened up and you were looking for content, Mars Hill was there before anybody else.
Well,
So it
that
elevated the
raises.
platform in a way that gave authority.
I mean, that raises the specter of how we grant authority within a lot of American evangelicalism. That it is based on the magnitude of your platform, your influence, your charisma, how entertaining you are. Which none of those things have anything to do with character or
Mhm.
spiritual depth or wisdom. The sort of biblical values that we ought to grant authority based on. Okay, talk a little bit about your connection to this story, because you allude to it in the early episodes that you were a pastor in this time. What was your experience of Mars Hill as an outsider? How did you feel the influence or the reverberations of Mark Driscoll's ministry on your own, perhaps on the other side of the
Mhm.
country?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was part of a church that planted in 2000. I served on staff there until 2015. And I was primarily oversaw kind of creative arts ministries, music and other stuff. We ran art galleries and music venues and all of this. And, um, you know, we, we sort of grew up like in the shadow or on the coattails of Mars Hill. We learned a ton from them. We modeled a ton after what they did. We weren't planted by Acts 29, but we joined as a partner church in 2003, and we were part of Acts 29 until 2010. And so, during that time, I got to know a lot of the folks at Mars Hill through Acts 29, many of whom are on the podcast. Um, and so, even early, as early as sort of the mid 2000s, you're hearing stories of like crazy stuff going on inside the church and conflict and stuff like that. But the other significant piece of the puzzle and the personal motivation for me is just the fact that our church lived a parallel in a unhealthy way too. We had rapid growth. By the 2000 teens, we're a few thousand people. 3,500 people, and 4 sites, and but just a really toxic leadership culture, revolving door of leaders. And you love this thing, so you fight for it for as long as you can, and then at some point the gas tank's empty and you jump off, which I did. And then a year and a half or so later, our lead pastor resigned under similar conditions. So
So your story is actually Mars Hill, just by a different
Driscoll.
name.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
When you mentioned your involvement with Acts 29, which is the church planting network that Mark sort of oversaw and was started by Mars Hill. When you started hearing those stories in the mid 2000s about some of the nuttiness going on behind the scenes, or some people having misgivings about Mark, his leadership, his character, did that raise red or yellow flags for you at the time, or did everyone kind of just give it a pass because, oh my gosh, look at how much ministry is happening, look at how many churches are being planted? Was that sort of the attitude? How did you react to those stories?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, it's it's one of those things where I don't know. It kind of went with with the territory, right? Like you had this way of kind of making these trade offs in your head, and if you're in ministry for any length of time, particularly if you're end up in a network or have a broad series of connections, you hear conflict stories from all kinds of churches, and
Right.
oh, that guy's a real jerk, or that's a hard place to work, or whatever, and so you'd hear those things. And I think the thing that got tossed around a lot, particularly with regard to Mark, was, he's our generation's Martin Luther. He's this uh, once in a generation leader, and Luther was this horrible guy, and but look at all the good he did. Um, so yeah, I mean, you make those calculations. Everyone does, and yeah, and for me personally, I mean, it was a thing where I knew, whatever the circumstances were in my life, like I didn't want to go work for him. But I think the kind of ripple effects, both in terms of what happened inside Mars Hill, but what happened inside Acts 29 and with other churches where they were following Mark's lead, I don't think anybody, I don't think anybody calculated that at the time. That came later.
I bring it up because I started working at Christianity Today in 2004. And in 2008, I became the managing editor of Leadership Journal, which is the magazine they had at the time for pastors and church leaders. So I was managing a small team of editors. And in that role, we got around the country. We went to conferences, we interviewed all kinds of people. We got to kind of peek behind the curtain at different ministry settings, churches, whatever. And we would often come back together and report to each other, like, who did you meet, right? Who's interesting? Who's a new and up and coming voice that we should pay attention to? What insights did you get from this event or that event or whatever? And part of that debriefing included occasionally, and I would argue appropriately, raising concerns about some people that we met or things we saw. And we ended up having an unofficial list of names of mostly very well-known church leaders that we had deep concerns about. Not enough evidence to report anything, scandalous going on, but just, a real check in the gut about this person and their maturity or their, whatever. And so I had an unofficial policy with the other editors that people on this list, we're not going to report negative things about them. We're not out to get them. We're not going to, deep six them in any way, but we're also not going to give them a larger platform. We're going to essentially pretend they don't exist. And that cost us something, because having a name like Mark Driscoll on the cover of our magazine or highly profiled is going to sell more magazines, right? He's such a big figure, and he wasn't the only one. But as I look back on that, every single name except one that was on that list has now been kicked out of ministry, basically, or had some huge scandal emerge in the time that came out. And we were able to discern some of that because of our access. But the average Christian out there who's just sees this person on a YouTube video or a podcast or, on the spine of a book has no idea whether they're worthy of giving them authority or platforming them. Which brings me to the question finally, as you've done this reporting and interviewing, what have you heard from people who were deeply involved in Mars Hill at the time? How did they justify some of the craziness that they saw? You were at a distance. It was easy for you to say, well, that's that other church. I don't have to, deal with it. But what did you hear from people who were deeply involved? How did they tolerate it or excuse it at the time they were witnessing it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? Like, that's the question for the whole podcast. Is I think it's so, like, one of the most frustrating things about these stories to me is that it's so easy for people from the outside who don't have any context in the community, don't have any relationships with the people involved. It's so easy to be far removed from the situation and go, well, I knew that guy was a problem. Like, that was
Right.
just obvious to me, right? But if this guy shows up in your life, and Jeff Becker told the story on the last podcast, this guy shows up in your life and he's like, I believe in you. I believe God, I believe in who God wants you to be. Here's money for an engagement ring. Your tour went bad. Let me pay your rent this month.
Come
Like,
and live in
let's
my basement.
come and live in my basement. Like, that's the context where all these guys got to know him, right? And interpersonally, he could be incredibly gracious. Like, we'll talk a little bit next week about how, again, like inside the inner circle, like Mark was renowned for, constantly paying grocery bills for single moms. He just had this heart for people like that. So I think the context of that kind of ministry and interpersonal relationship is massive. And I think the same thing exists in sort of different islands throughout the church. So, you come to Mars Hill and it's like, yeah, Mark says something crazy here and there, but man, this a lot of what he says I really love. I love the way he focuses on the Bible, and I've got this great community group. So, we'll tolerate the scandal here or there. And I think as well, and this was true for me, is you have these, you have these incredible seasons of ministry, and you have these deep and powerful nostalgic memories that power you through a lot. You're kind of sitting there going, man, maybe we could sort of tweak things and correct course and get back there. And that lasts a long, long time.
One of the things I do really appreciate about what you've put together on this show is you do a great job of revealing how Mars Hill was way more than Mark Driscoll. There were networks of relationships and community that were deeply redemptive to a lot of people. And so as the problems started mounting in Mark's leadership and more people became convinced that this is, a catastrophic flaw in the system, there was still a reluctance to chuck the whole thing or to walk away from the church because it was still their community. It was still their friends and family. It was the people who had walked with them through really difficult times. And it's a reminder to all of us that as broken and corrupt sometimes as our churches can be, there's also good things there as well. Like any individual is not entirely evil or good. No family is entirely healthy or dysfunctional. No church is entirely toxic or tove, to use Scott McKnight's language. But discerning when you're in the midst of it, when it's right to leave or when it's okay to stay, I mean, that's so hard. And I appreciate the graciousness with which you put together this series that reveals people in that dilemma and doesn't just judge them for not being harsher at the time. What do you think the implications of the Mars Hill story is for the rest of evangelicalism right now? What is kind of the lesson that you take away from it that you think the rest of us really need to grasp?
Yeah, I mean, like one answer for that is stay tuned. I think we'll have a lot to say because I think there's a lot to draw out. But I do think, I think one aspect of the Mars Hill story, and this is a preview of where we're going in a couple weeks. So, is that people didn't take seriously the fire they were playing with when they platformed and broadcast Mark, right? They didn't realize the power that was at their disposal, both in terms of the platforms they were using to get him out there in social media and all these different places where he built this massive internet following. But they also didn't realize the power and the weight of his authority as the guy in the pulpit. If again, like if you know him and he's this like, he's this guy who, is gonna exaggerate stories and say crazy things every now and then. But you're like, well, he makes me laugh and he's a good dude. And I know at the end of the day, like he takes care of people here and there and all this. You overlook some of that kind of crazy stuff. But if you're someone in the pews who came in and has none of that context to kind of discern that stuff, then that's the word of God. That's my pastor, right? And so I think we underestimate the kind of authority that gets vested in pastors and leaders. And because of that, we don't put the brakes on platforming and elevating people quickly enough when we see concerns.
So that raises something that's I still struggle with. One of the excuses I heard years ago for Mark, and there's been other leaders kind of cut from the same cloth. Think of James McDonald at Harvest here in the Chicago area and they were very close, him and Mark Driscoll, but had similar leadership style and also pretty dramatic downfall. But one of the excuses I heard over and over and over again from their followers was, look at how powerfully God is using them. Look at how many lives are being impacted. Look at how many churches are being planted. And I've never understood that argument because, at least when you look at scripture, God uses all kinds of things to accomplish his purposes. I mean, he uses prostitutes and evil kings like Pharaoh. He uses Judas. He uses frogs. He uses, the jawbone of an ass. He uses all kinds of things to accomplish his purposes. Just being used by God in and of itself is not evidence that you belong to God. But we tend to look at that alone and go, oh, well, then give him a bigger platform, give him more money, give him more exposure, give him more deference. For me, that's one of the big takeaways from these kinds of stories and from your podcast is we're just measuring and focusing on the wrong fruit so often. As you've had these interviews with people who were deeply engaged, how has it affected you? Like, were any of these conversations kind of lightning bolt moments for you as you heard from them that awakened a sense of issues that you hadn't anticipated?
Yeah. I think the weight I feel right now, the challenge right now, honestly, has been just grief. To hear over and over and over again, some of the stories of just loss, broken relationships, loss of faith, spiritual devastation, people who were pastors and leaders, who post Mars Hill, post the collapse, they lose their faith, they lose their marriage, they fall into addiction. And I think, it's one thing to sort of hear that in a way that I just described, right, to you. But to hear those stories again and again from people where those are their relationships, that's their context. That's been weighty. It's been a real personal challenge for me just to kind of go, how do I hold these stories even in my own head and heart as I try to tell them, as I try to translate them for other people. I guess I'd say like the surprise to me, and again, this is a little preview of where we're going in a couple of weeks, but the surprise to me is just this reality of like, there was no plan, right? Like this idea that you could have walked, there's sort of this idea that you hear of people like, well, Mark had this master plan and his goal was to sort of do this and to do that. And if you'd walked into his study in 2003, he could have mapped it all out for you. Or even like the stories that Mark would tell of like, well, God spoke to me and this is what I was going to do. And I was going to do this, that, and the other, and it's like you sit there and you talk to these creative guys who post Mars Hill are working with massive brands, doing what they did at Mars Hill for these brands because these brands saw the gifts they had in elevating someone like Mark. These guys were like young guys in their 20s going, hey, well, let's try this. Let's see how this goes. And it's like it's a sort of happy accident, and then that turns into sort of a horrible accident when the worst elements of a person's character end up taking over the organization.
Yeah, I think there's this delusion that a lot of us have that a celebrity pastor reaches that celebrity status because they are inherently brilliant, gifted, spiritually deep and mature. But you mentioned earlier he had this amazing team of people around him who could take some of Mark's unique qualities and magnify them enormously. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it's not necessarily evidence of maturity. And I don't like other church traditions have structures of accountability, right? They have a hierarchy. They have bishops or somebody who can look at a leader and go, no, he or she's still too young, still too inexperienced, still too immature to handle a bigger platform. But in a lot of American evangelicalism, we just think, oh, that dude can sell a lot more books, or he could bring a lot more people into the church or the conference or whatever. And we just keep building their platform for maybe economic reasons, but just because we can. And we don't stop and ask, should we? So yeah, and it's hearing the stories of, the downfall of people, their faith, their health, their marriages, their families. I mean, the question I want to ask is, was the entire Mars Hill experiment a net positive or a net negative? I don't know if it's an impossible question to answer, probably, but man, it's scary. Okay,
Let me say one thing real quick, if you don't mind. I just
sure,
want to,
yeah,
with regard to what you just said of sort of the platforms and the publishers and all this kind of stuff. One of the framings you hear a lot in the storytelling around this is, you know, um, Mark was opportunistic, and you know, as doors opened, he jumped through them and he climbed the ladder, and he went to all these different platforms, big pastors, big conference, all this kind of stuff. The flip side's true too. People saw Mark as this lightning rod, and this guy who could get a lot of attention, and they were using him too to elevate their own causes and
right,
platforms.
right.
Um, and that's something that we also need to interrogate. Like, what's our, you know, what's what's our what's our criteria for saying, hey, let's give that guy 10 years and then, you know, re-examine the idea of bringing him up. He's flying around the country speaking at conferences, telling people how to plant their church in 1997. He'd been a church planter for all of 12 months. That's insane, right?
Yep. A few years later, I was at some of those conferences where you're sitting in that room with some guy who's 6 months older than you, who has virtually no experience, giving you all of his wisdom about planting a church. I have been in those rooms, and it's just creepy. And you pull back the curtain and you realize, oh, he's up there because there's a publisher that's trying to
Mhm.
push his book, or there is some other economic interest that is driving this. It's not about maturity or wisdom. Um, and the other side, I'm really glad you bring that up. Like, as much as there were a bunch of entities that were pushing Mark and giving him a bigger platform and making money off of his name, there were other people who were sort of anti-Mark Driscoll, who built their platforms and built their reputations by trying to take him down. So again, there's a parallel to the Donald Trump phenomenon, where there were even liberal news outlets that despised Donald Trump, but they made a ton of money and got a lot of eyeballs by saying really horrible things about Trump. So they like the attention too. So yeah, the whole system is so bizarre and weird. Um, in your research of the story, can you identify a moment, like a jump the shark moment, where you think Mars Hill's fate was sealed? Like, there was no way. It had all these tumultuous things, and Mark had his issues, but there a point at which it was doomed? Like, there was no way this thing was going to survive. That's actually discernible, or do you think it could have been turned around
Mhm.
even up to the end, but it just wasn't going to happen?
It's so funny because the Mars Hill story is a bunch of stories, right? And it depended on kind of where you sat in the organization, which version of the story you tell. And so, I've had people call me and say, just furiously call me and say, how dare you attempt this story without talking to me? My story is the linchpin of what really happened at Mars Hill. And some of those people were deeply connected to Mars Hill, and some of those people were bloggers and critics from the outside
Mm-hmm.
um, who really, I mean, I think you look at some of the voices of the outside critics, they calcified Mark's leadership because the insiders were like, hey, whatever we think about Mark, we really don't like these people either. So we're going to stick with him for longer. Um, so I would say, from my perspective, I don't think there's one. I think there's sort of three or four kind of consistent moments where, in 2007, the polity changes and a certain element of the brakes kind of take off. And then a little later, Mark's relationship with the publishers changes. And, it's kind of like he used to take content to them. Now they're kind of dictating content to him. And that's a whole thing for sort of the brand and the ethic of the church. And then, there's a leadership change. There's a significant leadership change when the executive pastor leaves and a new executive pastor comes in. Um, and it's kind of like at each one of those moments, the the brakes come off on some of Mark's worst impulses, I think. So I don't think you can point to any one of them. It's a game of inches. It's like, well, we'll move the football here, and a few years later we'll move it here, and we'll move it here, and slowly it gets down the field. That's a bad metaphor. I need a better metaphor.
Maybe it's the frog in the kettle, right?
That's fine. That works.
Things happen. So, have you heard from Mark Driscoll?
No. Reached out a number of times, number of ways, and just no response at all. So,
because my understanding is he's started another church now in Arizona.
That's correct. Yeah, he's in Scottsdale, planted a church called Trinity that's grown and solid, and I think his online ministry is probably even more significant than his ministry in Scottsdale. But yeah, and there's a lot of stories coming out of Scottsdale that sound eerily reminiscent of what happened at Mars Hill. So,
wow, I don't want to minimize the capacity of God to redeem terrible circumstances and any one person, but I have to admit, all the stories that have come out in recent years from different church scandals makes me think that I don't know why we're in such a hurry to put people who from ministry back into ministry positions when they have these histories and stories. I think part of it's just because we've elevated ministry as the end all be all significant vocation, and that's too bad, because I think some of these folks would probably do well for themselves, their families, and others if they found a livelihood doing something else rather than repeating their errors. But I don't know.
Well, it's a very American thing too, right? Like, we love underdogs, we love redemption stories, and I think the fallen pastor gives us a little bit of both.
Yeah, but I think you can have a really beautiful, powerful redemption story without it being a restoration story, right? You don't have to be restored to that same position to be redeemed. And anyway, you just see it over and over and over again. Mike, thank you so much for your time today. Can you stick around for a few minutes and we'll do a little bonus segment for our Patreon folks?
Yeah, most definitely.
Okay. If you guys have not listened to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill from Christianity Today, you've got to listen. I mean, we don't often push other podcasts on our show because, we don't want to dilute our audience or anything, but this is so well done and so informative. And it's not just about Mars Hill. It really is about issues that affect broadly American evangelicalism. So definitely go check it out. And Mike, thank you so much for producing it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.